Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles constitutional, human rights and legal issues, bringing you information and analysis. My name is Dumile Mateza. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by calling us on our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498. Or you can tweet us at Rights Recourse. Alternatively, you can email your thoughts about this program and many others here on 404 Rights and Recourse at sabc.co.za. Be quiet and calm, my countrymen, for what is taking place now is what you came here to do. We are going to die, and that is what we came here for. Brothers, we are drilling the death drill. I, Recourse, say here and now that you are all my brothers, Zulus, Swazis, Pondos, Basutos, and all others. Let us die like warriors. We are all sons of Africa. Raise your war cries, my brothers. For though they made us leave our assegais back in our kraals, our voices are left with our bodies. The Reverend Isaac Wauchope Yoruba's voice carried across the decks of the SS Mendi and out into the silence of the fog that surrounded her. He was a chaplain on board the SS Mendi and was also on board for his multilingual talent as an interpreter, and boarded the ship with the rest in Cape Town. Today on Rights and Recourse, we pay tribute to the men who were aboard the SS Mendi, who died in the English Channel near the island of Wight. But first, let's have a look at this insert.
We restore the dignity and the humanity of the black soldiers who perished on that fateful day. We salute their courage, bravery, and commitment. We salute their quest for a more equal and just world. For the better world we are still working to achieve 100 years later.
To discuss today's topic, we are joined in the studio by Ms. Brenda Shepherd, an author, Mr. Fred Khumalo is also an author, and a renowned columnist, M.K. Malifane, and film producer. And at our Cape Town studio, we're joined by Professor Albert Grundling, is the chairperson of the History Department at the University of Stellenbosch. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon, Ms. Mateza.
Probably, Prof, I should start with you, because you always start with the professor. After the Convention of Vereniging at the conclusion of the Anglo-Boer War and the establishment of the Union of South Africa, Africans felt left out of the deal structured between the Boers and the English. Several deputations to the UK did not yield the required results, and things were somewhat tense on the political front, and Africans thought by getting to the war will give them a new status as Africans. Prof, did you hear me?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to respond by just briefly referring to the fact that Africans participated in what was known the Anglo-Boer War, and had exactly the same kind of hopes at the time. Now, come the First World War, there was some kind of reluctance to get involved in this again. But once again, ANC, that tiny sliver of an educated black middle class, thought this may perhaps be a golden opportunity to prove their worth and in the hope of improving their civic and political situation. And it's on the basis of that the ANC offered 5,000 men to join up as combatants. That offer was turned down, as the white government was afraid to arm black people. But in 1916, they were allowed to join as non-combatants.
But in this, I'm talking to you as authors now who did some research on the story. It would seem to me blacks did go to war to help do the same job in Southwest Africa at the time, which was known as German Southwest Africa, when the people who were involved in the war, the imperial people said, South Africa, just take a look, just take care of Southwest Africa for us.
Well, you know, the black soldiers went across as a labor force, and what Professor Grundling is talking about really is Walter Rabusana offered to recruit 5,000 soldiers to go to German Southwest, but this request was turned down by Louis Botha at the time. And then subsequently, the British government in 1916 sent a request to the British government, to Louis Botha, and this documentation, this correspondence was never made public, where they requested 10,000 black soldiers be sent to France as a labor force, but under imperial command. And imperial command was very important because it meant that there was little or no expense to South Africa, and it also meant that it didn't have to be approved by Parliament. It could be dealt with on an administrative basis.
Fred, I'm taking those words. They were asked to go to this war under imperial command. But it transpires that Louis Botha had other ideas. He wanted to transport apartheid from South Africa into France and suggested that they must be put in compounds, like a concentration camp with high fences, and even sent people from South Africa to look after these darkies because they might do something else.
Yes, before they even left South Africa, rules and regulations that would govern their presence in France at the barracks were written down, and many of them couldn't read. So these rules were read out and they had to memorize them. For example, once they got to France, they were confined at these barracks, and whenever they wanted to venture out into the town, they had to, even if they wanted to go into a shop to buy a pouch of tobacco, they had to be accompanied by a white person, an officer. Those were the rules. And of course, some of them were ridiculous and funny. If approached by a white woman, they must run, like, you know. It's one of those things that that speak to the fear that has always informed race relations in South Africa, especially back then.
MK, there's something that I'm saying this with great deal of respect. Could it be said that the African leadership at the time was somewhat naive, thinking that their participation in the war would yield positive results in their quest for recognition in the Union of South Africa?
I think firstly, let's make one important point clear. South Africa, that is Parliament under Smuts, when they were requested by King George to provide blacks for the war effort, they refused. And then they were told by the British that, incidentally, you don't have a choice. We all don't have a choice.
Because we are losing. Part of the Dominion.
No. We are losing the war. And we no longer have enough able-bodied men to continue the war. If you look at the ferocity with which the Germans onslaught against the Allies were. I remember when I went to France to Devilwood, first time, I think was in '92. The curator of the Devilwood Museum, a man with 2 PhDs in the First World War, an expert. We went on a walkabout in the snow, and then I saw this big gash in the ground that with bent out grass, hollowed out. And he said, here, had you come a week earlier, you'd have been part of a funeral. We buried a 16-year-old girl who had warmed herself up, and then an unexploded shell from World War I exploded and killed her into smithereens. And then when you look at the countryside, it's undulating, almost like in a science fiction movie. Thousands of unexploded bombs planted during First World War. He is the one who confirmed to us, he said, the war was being lost by the Allies.
But MK, if the war was being lost,
yes.
These soldiers who left South Africa, the South African Native Labour Contingent,
yes.
or the South African Native Labour Corps, yes. We're not going to be taking part in a war, we're not going to be fighting?
Look, the British and the Allies required them largely for labour, but as well as to replenish the front lines, because there were no more enough able-bodied men. They were losing the war. And then consequently, the condition by the South African Parliament was we will only, if that is the case, agree with our natives, provided they don't bear arms.
But Prof, it would seem to me there was something strange here. Your Cape Corps, made up of coloureds, were allowed to carry arms. Why were these ones not allowed to carry arms? Guys, you can chip in. Don't wait for us to ask you a question, because all of us have done research on this thing.
Yes, the Cape Corps is an interesting case. Initially, they were also refused arms. But under some weird kind of misapprehension, what happened in East Africa was that soldiers died from malaria. Somehow or another, Jan Smuts argued that Cape-coloured people will be more immune to malaria than white people. And for that particular reason, that's one of the reasons that played into his decision to arm Cape-coloured people to go to East Africa. But I just want to get back to the compound system again.
Yes.
As Fred has mentioned, that they were heavily policed in the compound system. But despite that, I don't think one should lose sight of the fact that they still had a certain agency. Many of them actually did go out with white women despite the restrictions. Yeah. Not many, yes, but some did go out with white women. Yeah. And ultimately, they revolted against the compound system. And because of that, in 1918, the Botha government decided to stop what they call this experiment, and those that remained in France were then called back.
I also picked up something, this experiment, now that the professor's talking about an experiment. Many people in South Africa, including clergy and some of the ministers in Louis Botha's government, thought that they could use this experiment in South Africa after the war. And picking up from this Pritchard guy who was in charge of this whole thing. I don't know whether Pritchard Street in Johannesburg is named after him. This Pritchard guy who was in charge of this whole thing, and that is probably why we had white superintendents in all townships.
I just want to come back to these closed compounds, because, you know, it wasn't only black South African soldiers that went over during the First World War as a labour force. MK is quite correct. Within the opening months of the war, the British Army took heavy losses, and they virtually lost their professional army. So they were looking for soldiers, active men, to go to the front to fight. But labour came from China, it came from Egypt, and it also came from India. And they were all housed in similar conditions. And in fact, I will go as far as saying that the Chinese contingent they weren't even issued with uniforms, although they did.
Apparently they worked 24 hours.
Well, I can't say that, but I would certainly say they were also working very hard, because it was very important to keep the supply lines open. They did a job by sending and loading ships, sending the supply lines, supplies, the armaments through to the front line, which was very important at that stage of the war. You can't fight a war without arms and food and ammunition.
Yes, just to reinforce that point by Brenda here, it's very easy for us, speaking with the benefit of hindsight, very dismissively about the role played by these men. I mean, you cannot prosecute a war without logistics, without transport, without manpower. Remember, those days technology was kind of primitive, so you needed a lot of people actually carrying cannons and what have you, offloading them from the ships at different ports, all the way to the Western Front. So the role that they played is very crucial, and it should be acknowledged as such. And moving on to the issue of the compound system, yes, panelists here, starting with the professor in Cape Town, point out that there were rebellious members of the Labour Corps who went out in defiance to the regulations. And my character, Peter Mdaung, actually did that. And subsequently, after the war, got married to a French woman. That is part of the defiance. Although he is not really based on a real person, but he embodies that spirit.
Well, when you come back, we'll go into the ship and just tell you what might have been happening on the ship. If you'd like to join us, you can call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Recourse. Stay with us.
Now, this is Trends, of course, your one-stop serving of all that's juicy and trending in the world of entertainment and showbiz. My name, of course, is Refill Wemwilo.
I'm Dr. Sello Mutaung, and this is Health Talk.
A very good morning and welcome to Media Monitor. I'm your host, Alicia Jolly.
My name is Dumile Matez.
What time is it? It's question time.
For your daily dose of current affairs, tune in to the SABC News Channel.
Welcome back as we go through a history lesson here tonight, taking you back to 1917, 100 years ago. Professor, you wanted to add something to what we were talking about earlier. Probably you can say that briefly so that we can go into something else.
Now, I was just about, and I think you're about to talk about what happened on the ship.
Yes.
Where the so-called death dance. Perhaps if I can just say something about that now. And that is a story that's being told over and over again. And if one does extensive research on it, then one starts questioning it. Because there were no survivors that actually saw this. There were no eyewitnesses. The ship sank within 20 minutes. It was cold in the English Channel at that time. There was confusion. The men were not used to the sea. To expect that kind of nationalist grandstanding is probably not believable. And in our researches on this, I went into considerable depth trying to establish how this came about. And what I did find was that Mbongi S.E.K. Makwai, he was born 1875, lived till 1945. He was a highly rated Mbongi. He took a particular interest in this Mendi venture. And much of his poetry revolved around that. And I think that story emanated from Makwai. Even Mandela had a very high regard for Makwai. His poetry caused the men's blood to race through their veins, it was said. And I think that story can be related back to Makwai's influence. Also, there's nothing strange to it. These kind of incidences often get exaggerated in nationalist mythology. Afrikaner history is replete with those kinds of exaggerations. So British history, Delville Wood has been exaggerated. So one mustn't see anything strange in this. And as a matter of fact, it's intriguing how long this survived. So it shows you the kind of traction that Makwai had, as opposed to, one can argue, the actual event that probably, in all probability, didn't take place. So I'm going to leave it at that for the time being. Thank you.
Let me straight go to Fred. Fred, because your book is based on the dance, the dancing, the death drill. Well, even the Wessex archaeology documents are saying there's no evidence from survivors' account that either Yoruba speech or the death dance did actually take place.
Yes, I'm happy that the professor brought the issue of mythology in history, not just this particular pocket of our history. In Afrikaans history, it's always been informed by mythology. What's wrong with that? I mean, we are human beings, we thrive on mythology, we thrive on stories. And I don't see any contradiction whatsoever in us deriving strength and bravery and courage to look forward to the story of the Mendi from these words. So the story of the actual dance and the chanting, which is attributed to Reverend Joba, probably historically, factually didn't happen. But we do need myths that sustain us as a nation. And not just as a nation, as human beings. Mythology is part of our DNA. We tell stories in order to survive. But with particular reference to this story, it wasn't written by Mkai. Mkai's poem he wrote a number of poems about
He wrote
this.
2 poems
Yes,
around. He wrote
yeah.
one before they left
Yes.
called Umkhosi Wemidaka,
Yes,
where he
yes.
actually makes also somewhat of a exaggeration where he
Yes.
says, Zenimbambu Kaisara, Nizenaye.
Yes, but this particular one is not related to Mkai whatsoever.
Well, yes, I just want to go back to something else because I wanted us to talk about the ship leaving Cape Town, and the professor took us real to the end. I wanted to talk about the ship leaving. What must have been happening on the ship? I know it stopped in Lagos, and the guys were shocked to find people a country that was run by black people.
Well, I just want to say this. They left on the 16th of January, bright summer's day. They left Cape Town Harbour as part of a convoy with 5 other convoy ships, troop ships, under the escort of HMS Cornwall, because at that stage of the war there was safety in numbers and the threat of German submarines was very real. And they did stop at Sierra Leone, but the whole convoy stopped there. And on board the SS Mendi, as well as the Kenilworth Castle that was carrying a contingent of 1,500 white South African soldiers, both these ships carried cargoes of gold. And at Sierra Leone, the gold from the Mendi was offloaded, loaded onto HMS Cornwall, and then HMS Cornwall actually set sail, leaving the convoy behind.
Go ahead.
Fortunately, the convoy reached England safely, but without the protection of the destroyer.
MK, you have a very fascinating story that you wanted to tell me about real people. I know Fred was talking about a mythical person, and you have real people who did something strange in France.
Yes. I interacted, engaged, and lived with the actual war veterans of World War I, of South African Native Labour Corps. In particular, Mita Mahwati, who served in both World Wars. And he told me of stories and their experiences in the same compound, outside of the compound, that much as there were restrictions placed on them because of South Africa, in battle, they fought back. He told me of a story of one of his comrades who actually, when the battalion was almost wiped out and he had several scores of injured men, all white, one of the black members of the Native Labour Corps took up the arms to protect and fight back to protect the injured whites. Instead of being treated like a hero after the battle, he was court-martialed. And when he was court-martialed, there was near mutiny, which was quickly suppressed to show that, you know, they were restricted by South Africa, but they still were soldiers. And
There's
fought.
another story that is being told, Professor, if you want to come in here, about a Charles, who wanted to do his washing outside, and these South African people who were looking after them said, no, you can't do your clothes outside, you've got to go inside. And there was a big mutiny, and 13 people were killed in that mutiny. Prof?
That was a mutiny which started off the general kind of resistance against being housed in the compounds. That mutiny wasn't, it was relayed to South Africa only after a while, to the South African authorities. It was suppressed for a while. But that started off a general resistance against the compound system. But just for the sake of interest, I would like to take the story back a bit, and let's look at why these men landed up in the ship in the first place. What were the kind of motivation for these people to join up? And what is interesting is that the ANC initially had some reservations about supporting the call for a non-combatant contingent. They would have preferred Africans to be armed. And if one looks at the number of people who've joined up and where they came from, the areas they came from and the kind of background they came from, it is clear that about 25% or so belong to that tiny sliver of black middle-class people, teachers, clerks, ministers of religion, etc. The rest were some of them were peasants, many of them were actually from the northern Transvaal at the time, currently Limpopo, where there was a heavy drought, which compelled them towards the military, where they could earn £3 a month, which was higher than the 50 shillings they could have earned on the mines. So poverty played a major part in forcing people to join up. That happens in most wars anyway.
Taking it from what the professor is saying, Brenda and Fred, this happens 3 years after the passing of the 1913 Land Act. And nobody has no land. Everybody is just living in squalor. And there is an opportunity to go overseas. And everybody thought, going overseas, I might be rich, even if, because when you, for instance, let's take it a simple thing. If I go home, I'm from Johannesburg, people think I've got a lot of money because I'm from Johannesburg.
I just want to follow on what the professor has said. You know, the black South African soldiers really enlisted for a period, or they signed on for a period of 12 months. The white soldiers signed on for the duration of the war. The black soldiers, quite rightly, were earning £3 a month, whereas the white soldiers were earning £1 a month. So that was the prize of the labour force. So it was highly sought after. And also these men, you must remember at the time, South Africa was part of the war. The newspapers were full of articles on the war. A lot of young men would have seen it as a chance of adventure. The mines were on a go slow. So, and also the drought. Drought gripped a large part of our country.
The other question, Fred and MK, who was this man, Isaac William Joba?
Joba came from what is now called the Eastern Cape, I think Fort Beaufort.
No, he came from Utenek. He wasn't Fort Beaufort, he was a minister of religion.
Yes, he was a minister of religion, quite a prominent member of society. From what I have read, I haven't read a book-length account of his life. So all I know is based on what people have written about him very briefly. So I'm not an authority on who he was, but he was appointed chaplain because of his credentials and the charisma that he exuded. Yeah.
I would just like to add on that.
Yes.
Sorry. You know, Isaac Wachop was 64 years of age when he was on board this ship. He was a minister and also a pacifist. You know, he went to war as an interpreter, not a minister. He was a highly educated man. He'd been educated at Lovedale, and he spoke English, Xhosa, Sotho, Zulu.
And Dutch.
Yeah, and also he could, he had an understanding of Greek and Hebrew. You know, he'd been schooled. He was an educated man, and he formed part of that educated group from the Eastern Cape, highly regarded.
But you know, Reverend Wachop had consulted with the ANC as he was one of the regional leaders.
In fact, the South African National Native Congress at the time, the ANC today, was actively recruiting people to go to the war.
Yes. And the understanding, yes, there was hunger, unemployment, there were material benefits to accrue, but ultimately going to a foreign land to fight in a white man's war and to die, which was what the understanding of the men were, could only have been for a higher cause, which is their freedom. And there were overtures made to them by King George that they would impress upon the South African government when the men served well on their return to get their freedom. So they went to war believing that they would gain their freedom.
Well, yes,
so we have to remember, just to add on Mr. Malefanya's point there, just after the passing of the Native Land Act, the ANC had sought an audience with the Queen at that time, who couldn't see them. So this was a second opportunity to prove their commitment to the Union of South Africa, to say, we are throwing our lot with you in the hope that you will reciprocate. So that was the understanding, naive as it might have been, but that was the understanding.
And also the South African, it was called the South African Native Congress, suspended all activities for the duration of the war as a show of loyalty to the king and country.
Well, talking about what MK is just saying, I'll come to you, Professor, just now. One of them, I think Max Mukwena, makes the point. He says at one meeting, he said that the king had told them, when you return to South Africa, you must fight for your freedom, which will be granted to you. And that's one of the strong things they believed in. Prof?
Yes, one has got to look more carefully at reasons why these men joined. Undoubtedly, some of them had the idea of freedom at the back of their minds. But even within the Congress ranks, there was opposition to this idea. And they were just being seen as being good native boys trying to ingratiate themselves with the white government. So there wasn't, and there was a sense of realism about that criticism, because the chances of having their positions elevated and being granted freedom must have been wasn't, in a matter of fact, very slight. So there was sufficient reason to question the reality of these aspirations. But still, that did inspire some people to join. But then there was the majority of them joined for a very different set of reasons, amongst others for very personal reasons. Some got involved in romantic entanglements, unrequited love. As Brenda said, some had some touristic idea about going abroad. And then what one mustn't forget is that many of the chiefs also dragooned these people into joining, because pressure was being put on the chiefs by the white authorities. They were simply told, you've got to go over the water, and they obliged.
Let me come to something else, what the professor is saying, Fred. One of the people who was asked to help recruit some of these people was a guy, apparently, Mr. Lucius, who actually put down violently the Bambata rebellion.
Yes, you will, if you look at the breakdown of the number of people who enlisted, it is curious that such a big region, Zululand and Natal, contributed a very small number of people. The Bambata rebellion was still very fresh in their minds.
Which was in 1906?
1906. It was still very fresh in their minds. And why would then they felt they would be betraying the cause of the king at the time to go and throw in their lot with an empire that had so viciously suppressed them.
I read that amongst the people who went to the war was King Cetshwayo's cousin.
Yes, that's another contradiction. He was there. He enlisted to go over there, because again the royal family was divided, as was the Zulu royal family was divided, as was the ANC on the issue.
I want us to move to the dramatic part of leaving Plymouth to St. Catherine, to France. But I first want us to go to a break, and we hope you can still join us and call us on 011 714 5497 and 5498. Alternatively, you can tweet us at Rights and Recourse or send an email to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
Failure to implement the water restriction is going to make the system not workable. For the domestic use, everyone should not exceed 25 kiloliters per day.
What is the penalty, and how much have you raked in thus far as a municipality?
For domestic users, if they exceed 25 kiloliters, then they're going to be charged a penalty on their monthly bill. And so far, already we've collected 1.7 million.
The 200 million rand state-of-the-art school in Magaliesburg had been vandalized by drug addicts. How bad is it?
It's very bad. Into the hostel residents, it was even worse, because
There, the doors, the wardrobes, the beds, the ceiling were broken down. Showers were ripped off, and it couldn't be used by students who are actually using that particular boarding facility.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse as we discuss the sad story of the singing of Mandy 100 years ago, giving you a bit of a history lesson. Let me come back to you, MK. There were 3 chiefs on board, 3 Pondo chiefs, Chief Bokleni, Chief Ndamase, and Chief Bangani. Surely Reverend Wokop, who was the interpreter, would have been a subject of these chiefs.
He was a subject, but they nonetheless accorded him the respect as a well-educated African, because they relied on him to communicate with the with the white officials. And when they arrive in war, they will go. I mean, in Europe, they were going to rely even more on him as the one who was most educated than themselves.
Well, not only that, you know, Isaac Wauchope spoke English.
Yes,
so a lot of these men could not speak English. So they would rely heavily on the interpreters to translate and act as a go-between between them and the officers on board.
I would imagine, Professor, the ship stops in Lagos, the ship stops in Sierra Leone. There would have been some drills as to what happens when there's an accident or when there's a calamity.
There was limited, yes, there were some death drills, or some drills rather, which take place on all seafaring vessels. But to what extent it was insisted upon and to what extent it was repeated for people who were not seafaring or not familiar with the sea, I'm unsure about that. And then just to get back to the question of the African clergy connected with the labour contingent, it is interesting if one digs into that kind of relationship between them and the white authorities. Often they prefer to side with the white authorities as opposed to siding with the majority of the men. They were caught betwixt and between, and often they chose to align themselves with authorities as such, which is interesting in itself.
The other thing I want to go to is they arrive in Plymouth and they have to leave. Why do they have to, or in other words, they have to leave at night, they travel at night to avoid other ships that are, was that the reason?
You know, at that stage of the war, the threat of German submarines was very real. A lot of ships had been sunk in that English Channel within sight of land. And really the reason that they were traveling at night was under the protection of darkness and generally at full speed to avoid being torpedoed by submarines. And I also just want to mention at this stage that the Mendi had on board 6 lifeboats. We're talking about boat drill. 6 lifeboats that were allocated to captain and crew, with some space allocated to black soldiers. And also on board for the soldiers were life rafts, which were allocated at various places around the ship.
MK, one of the things I came across was the people on board were allocated to their, you said you mentioned it, Brenda, when we were off air, around the people who were in charge who have to look after their own men.
Well, they were allocated stations on the ship. So when the signal went off, they were trained that with 4 signals, 4 whistle blasts, they would immediately gather at their stations. At the beginning of the voyage, each man was issued with a life belt, with orders that they were not allowed to leave their life belt. They had to have it with them at all times. So at the blast of 4 whistles, they were automatically they had to assemble at various life points around the ship. where they would be instructed in life drill.
One of the things that is strange to me, we all understand that those days the ships were quite primitive, and all ships were of the same level, quite primitive, because there's a story where apparently the man in charge of the ship, the captain, has to go from one place to the other to go and instruct and go and check what's going on, then go back to go and instruct. And at some stage during they are moving from Plymouth towards St. Catherine, there's this fog that is coming into this area of the English Channel. That must be scary. And
well, they left Plymouth at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Now we must just bear in mind as well, the Mendi set sail from Cape Town in the middle of summer, arrived on the 20th of February into winter time, and it was one of the coldest winters on record at that stage. And 21st, she left at 5 o'clock on the evening of the 20th to cross the English Channel under the cover of darkness, and very early on they started encountering fog. And they would have hugged the coastline and then made a dash across. And at about 3 or actually before midnight, heavy fog set in and she started blowing her whistle, because now the threat of a collision in the English Channel was a greater possibility than German submarines, because the visibility was virtually non-existent.
Yes, just to add there in terms of the speed.
We'll give a chance, Professor. Go ahead, Frank.
Yes, accounts from that time tell us that the Captain Yardley, dispatched 2 men to go up to the forecastle because visibility was really bad. So they were his extra pair of eyes to see what was happening there, just as an extra precautionary measure.
Yeah, when they set off actually from Plymouth, they had soldiers also on lookout duty together with sailors that would have been on the bow and in the crow's nest and at various points, keeping a lookout constantly. Because those days there was no radar, you had to rely on your eyes and ears.
At this stage of the journey, Professor, what do we know about the SS Darrow?
Thank you. Yes, that was just about what I was about to raise, the issue of the SS Darrow. And that was controversial in itself, because the ship was much bigger than the Mendi, and it was sailing too fast as well. But more important than that, once this accident happened, the captain of the SS Darrow, H.W. Stump, didn't do much. He only had made feeble attempts to try and save the survivors. Another ship, the HMS Brist, did much more. But the Darrow, which was solely responsible for the accident, actually was very lax in trying to rectify what it's caused. And there was an inquiry afterwards about why did this happen the way in which it did. And it was seen that the captain of the SS Darrow lost his nerve, and that his license was revoked for a year. But in South Africa, there were accusations that because there were black people on board, he wasn't that concerned. The evidence is unclear about that, but one is duty-bound to ask, why was he so feeble in his attempts? Was it just a question of losing his nerve, or was there more to it? One can't say it pronounce with any certainty, but it's certainly a matter that is worth raising.
Brenda, you wrote extensively about the inquiry in your book.
Yes, indeed. My book actually includes a large portion of the transcripts from this hearing, and I would just like to add that on conclusion of this hearing, these transcripts were classified as a secret document. And the question is asked 3 times over whether, if these soldiers had been white soldiers, would they have been treated in the same way? And with regard to Stump, you know, for 4 hours, the Darrow stood stationary within 200 yards of where the Mendi lay sinking. She sank within 20 minutes and eventually sank. And reports are from witnesses on board the Darrow that they could clearly hear the men in the water. Although the fog was so thick and black, they couldn't see them. But at no time during this period of 4 hours did the captain give the order to lower a lifeboat. And this was even after 2 lifeboats pulled up alongside the Darrow, piled high with men. And a lot of these men actually had to be carried up on board. They were so done in from the time they'd spent in the water, because also the temperature of the water at that stage was about 8 degrees.
MK,
it is recorded as well by witnesses that even of those fewer, more able-bodied young men who managed to swim to the lifeboats that were beginning to sail away, they were seen being kicked back into the water by one Mafuta. I think I've said, it is recorded. Yeah. What I'm saying is that the SS Darrow stood by, as you say, and did not do anything about it, not out of losing one's nerve. These were soldiers who had been in war. It was deliberate. What needs to happen is the reopening of the inquiry into the sinking of Mendi, which I believe will demonstrate that it was not an accident.
We'll come to that. Fred, you mentioned this morning. I saw an interview of yours on one of the opposition stations talking about blacks being kicked off some of the boats.
Yes, the incident that Mr. Malefane has just alluded to, I also use that because it's been carried in many versions or narratives of the same story. So I use that as well in my novel to illustrate that there was also the element of racism there that we can't run away from. Captain Stump's very unfortunate attitude and reluctance to help only fuels those rumors that it was because these victims were black. So the incident of people being kicked back into the water as they tried to clamber onto the life raft doesn't help at all.
There's an interesting story.
Sorry, can I just interrupt there for 1 second? Because the story of Mafuta is, he is a white sergeant. And it happens on a raft. It's not a lifeboat. He's on a raft.
It's a raft, yeah.
The lifeboats were so full that men were hanging onto the side, and men were hanging onto the backs of men hanging onto the side. And this happened on the life rafts itself. And for Mafuta in the water, there was a letter that actually named him that was at the castle in Cape Town and has subsequently been lost. But it certainly wasn't the lifeboats, it was a life raft. And these life rafts were wooden structures that were thrown into the water that were allocated to the soldiers and their officers. And the men had to jump in after them and hang on to either the sides or sit on top. And they could take about 25 men.
There's a story I picked up from my research that an Alpheus Miloa Zagubi and a few others drifted for 3 days and were picked up off the coast of Dorset.
Yes.
Terrible stories of how these young men died. How do we in South Africa, what kind of commemoration did we have henceforth from then on? Professor, probably I should go to you. How was this celebrated in South Africa? How were the news received in South Africa?
Initially, with the unusual sight of an all-white parliament arising in Parliament in salute to those who've died, which in 1917 was very unusual. And the family of the men who died received £50. Some of them, not all of them, £50. From 1928 onwards, there was a strong febrile awareness of the Mendi in black consciousness. And it translated into annual Mendi Memorial Days. It translated into the Mendi Memorial Fund, where the emphasis on education is the way to get ahead. And numerous scholars were awarded bursaries to go to Fort Hare. By 1945, with the Second World War, there was a sense that what were all these sacrifices for? We seem to be going through the same process with no advance that can be recorded or registered. And at that point, the Mendi Memorial Day speeches became what the government, the UP government at the time, regarded as more extremistic. After 48, the National Party government didn't ban these meetings, but it wanted to instill a kind of very ethnic quality to it, infuse it with the ethnic quality. And although it wasn't banned, it wasn't encouraged. Blacks weren't supposed to participate in a white war in the first place. In the 1980s, strangely enough, there was a complete turnabout. At this point, with the uprisings and the general turmoil and turbulence in South Africa in the 1980s, some black people activists thought, this is no longer appropriate to celebrate blacks fighting on behalf of whites in a war. But at the same time, the National Party now rediscovered the Mendi and thought it was a good way to win Western sympathy by saying that blacks and whites have always fought together. And that was when the first plaque was installed at Delville Wood. So this memory of the Mendi had various permutations, and it's still being played out to this day, where every successive round of politicians give their own spin to it.
How should we remember Mendi?
Firstly, Professor, if I may point out, yes, Parliament did rise because they had to do that on the insistence of King George. After that, Mendi was written off history books. In the English Channel, all the ships that are sunk there, even those that were sunk before even the World War I, are protected as war graves. All of them, save for one Mendi, that one called Mendi, well, at the time it didn't exist. Had it not been for a British diver, Martin Woodward, that I later worked with, and we actually filmed the Mendi wreck underwater. He, as a diver, had tried everything, especially with the South African government, to assist identify this ship, this lone ship that every Tom, Dick and Harry diver was taking relics of because it is not protected. And South African government refused to acknowledge that that ship is Mendi, until he brought artifacts that were written Mendi and he pieced it together. He's got a museum on the Isle of Wight that has these holdings. And that's how Mendi was identified, and that's how I met him.
I thought the Commonwealth War Graves Commission was looking after what happened, and I'm told
all of them, not Mendi, because South Africa would not recognize
all
it
of
as one
them,
of their own. Yes.
I'm also told that there are moves, if not done already, that Mendi will be made part of the United Nations war grave, recognized as a war grave by UNESCO.
It has since been, only recently, but all these years, it was a playground of every diver because South Africa refused to recognize its existence.
In the United Kingdom, during the week on the 21st, there was a special debate on Mendi at the House of Commons. Should we have the same thing?
I just want to say on this, the issue of the wreck of the Mendi. The wreck was really discovered in 1974 by Martin Woodward, and it was identified because it was discovered in a place they didn't realize that the wreck was, and it was identified by a plate lying on the floor of the ocean. But it's lying 40 meters below the surface, and it's very, very difficult to dive there. And pieces are in the Cape Town Museum, Port Elizabeth Museum, as well as on the Isle of Wight.
Well, Fred, unfortunately, we've run out of time. It's a very fascinating story about a history that involves us and our people. And from all of you, MK, there are commemorations that are being held. There's going to be one in Port Elizabeth, one in Cape Town, and one in Pretoria.
On the 26th of May, Africa Month or Africa Day, we will be having the first international commemoration that comprises all of Africa and the diaspora, because the centenary of World War I is actually dedicated to the role and contributions of men of color.
Well, yes, on receiving the news of the disaster at the parliamentary seat, the Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa, General Louis Botha, made this impassioned plea reflection. Ever since the war broke out, the natives have done anything possible in the struggle without doing anything which was in conflict with the loyalty of the flag and the king. It has never in history of South Africa, Mr. Speaker, that in one moment, by one foul swoop, such a lot of people have perished. And Mr. Speaker, I think that where people have died in the way they have done, it is our duty to remember that where people have come forward in their own accord and of their own free will, that they have done well, right down to their everlasting credit. This has been Rights and Recourse. This program is repeated on Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock. Please do join us next week again when we have a similar program from all of us here in the studio. Thank you to our guests and good afternoon.